Hi and welcome to School Shorts with me, Melissa Chan Green, journalist and mum of two, with an interest in all things education, but especially around the science of learning. And someone who has been researching that far, far longer than me is Pam Snow. She is a speech language pathologist, a psychologist and researcher at Trobe University. She's also writing a very popular blog post that goes out called The Snow Report. And there was one that particularly caught my eye. It was called Calling Time on Parent Blame and Children's Reading Success, basically saying that schools actually need to accept accountability for whether a child is learning to read well or not parents. Now, she accepts that it can be quite controversial to assert that parents should not be blamed for this. So I spoke to her about why she believes that and what she thinks parents are responsible for. Well, Pamela, thank you so much for your time. And as I said, I have been an avid reader of the Snow Report, and I recommend that to all parents because there's a lot of information there for teachers, but a lot that parents can take away too. And if we look at the two groups, I just wondered if you could make some comment on whether you think parents and educators are clear on their own roles when it comes to children and learning to read.
It's a very good question, Mel. I think I might try and deal with the two groups separately. I think there has been some muddied waters actually in recent decades on this because of the idea that learning how to read is something sort of somewhat natural. It's an immersive experience. There's been, I think, a romantic view in a lot of education circles that as Sue Knight, a principal here in Victoria, says, that we can love children to literacy, just by reading them beautiful books, and they'll just magically intuit the process of reading, which very few children do. So that's muddied the waters for teachers with respect to their role, because we haven't been adequately equipping teachers with the specialised knowledge and skills that they need to take children from novice status to expert, in inverted commas, as in competent, independent after 3 years of schooling. That doesn't mean that their reading journeys are over after 3 years of schooling, but they need to be out of the starting blocks. They need to be off the on-ramp and on the freeway after 3 years of formal schooling. And so I don't think teachers have been done any favours by ideas that have been instilled in them in their pre-service education about what the reading process is and how difficult it actually is to get all children from that novice to expert status. And so that's meant that when a significant proportion of children struggle in whole language balanced literacy classrooms, teachers often aren't equipped to understand why or to know what to do next, to identify those students and to be putting in place appropriate supports and interventions. Of course, we shouldn't be teaching in the first place in ways that promote high levels of academic failure. And then for parents, there's been a discourse, I think, in some education circles that it's really on parents to teach children how to read, that this is something that should be happening in the home environment in the same way that between birth and school entry, children acquire oral language predominantly in the home environment and then in daycare settings and preschool contexts and so forth through immersive experiences. And I think that reflects a fundamental misconception about the distinction between oral language as something that's biologically primary. So it is largely going to develop through those immersive everyday experiences because we humans have an evolutionary advantage for oral language. It's not completely set and forget, but we do have an advantage for it. And there's been a tendency in education circles to want to conflate reading with that process and treat it the same way. And then that moves us into an unfortunate space of parent blame when children do struggle. We hear education academics, unfortunately, sometimes say things like, well, if parents just read to their children more, and some famous children's authors, unfortunately, say things like this too, if parents just read to their children more, then literacy problems would somehow magically vanish. And there's absolutely no substance to that. We want parents to read to their children if they can. We need to recognise that not all parents are themselves capable readers. Not all parents are literate. But of course, we want parents to do what they can in the home environment, ideally from birth, in exposing children to books, to the beautiful vocabulary and the background knowledge and the complex sentence structure, and to the experience, the lovely parent-child experience of sharing book time together. But we mustn't kid ourselves that that's the same as teaching children to read. It's not teaching children how speech and print map to each other. It would be like saying we want children to learn the piano, so we're going to sit down together and listen to recordings of Mozart piano sonatas. Now, that might help children to enjoy listening to Mozart piano sonatas, but it's not going to teach them to play the piano. If we want to teach them to play the piano.
If only it did, right?
Well, if only it did, we'd have a lot more very capable musicians.
Yes.
So I think the messages have been muddied and unclear for both teachers and parents.
And do you think this is why, because of those misperceptions, do you think this is why when you wrote, it's time to stop the blame game on parents, that it was actually quite a controversial thing to say? Were you expecting it to be taken as controversial?
Not really, although nothing surprises me these days in reading circles, because I think some various stakeholders have developed various somewhat baked on ideas about reading and the reading process, and I guess it's hard for all of us as humans sometimes to stand back from our assumptions and our core beliefs and to check those. And clearly that blog post was very triggering for some people who did have a baked on belief that this is largely something that needs to be happening in the home. I guess the logical extension of that is, well, why stop at reading? What about fractions and quadratic equations and algebra and trigonometry? Where does parents' responsibility end? Where does school's responsibility begin? But I think there's that fundamental conceptual piece missing, that this is a biologically secondary skill. Reading, writing and spelling are things that our brains have evolved to be able to do, but not to do on their own. They're not the same as oral language, and we all do better when we're exposed to high-quality explicit teaching in that critical first 3 years of school. That's not to say that there can't be some catch-up after that, but we've got to get things right in the first 3 years of school.
Well, and this too isn't, it's the opposite of criticism on teachers, right? You're saying that teachers have a real skill. They are particularly trained in the right way to teach children to read. And so actually, when it comes to something that is as crucial as teaching children to read, it should be left to these people who are really expert, and parents can do what they can to assist, and I'll ask you about that soon.
Yes.
But is that what you're saying?
Yes, almost. But I think we've let teachers down in making them experts on reading and the reading process. So teachers should be professionally equipped. Teachers should have a specialised body of knowledge that other people don't have about the nature of the English writing system and the inner workings of the English writing system. in fact, whole language balanced literacy paradigms have let teachers down, and that's contributed to the problem. But it really begs the question, well, why are children going to school if it's the job of parents to teach them how to read? Is school just a kind of finishing school? Is that just to polish things off? I think that deprofessionalises teachers to say that teaching reading is the job of parents. So what is the job of teachers then? Is it just to keep children busy between 9 a.m. and 3:30 p.m. so parents can go to work?
I think, and we know it's not.
And we know it's not.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think education as a discipline has been done a real disservice when we talk about these things not being the core work of teachers. And that, of course, segues into another whole discussion about autonomy and accountability. If teachers want some level of autonomy, and I would argue that the professions that we tend to regard in high esteem in our Western societies are not the ones that actually have high levels of autonomy. Pilots and surgeons and engineers, for example, have surprisingly low levels of autonomy and very high levels of public accountability. And I think that's the conversation that needs to be had in education, that if we're looking at a set of scales, we've got one rock on the autonomy side and 5 rocks on the accountability side. And I don't think education is at that point yet, unfortunately.
That is a really interesting discussion. Yeah. Do you see yourself as a teacher, as a professional, as carrying out a particular skill that all teachers carry out together, or are you kind of but formulating your own way of doing it?
Well, choose your own adventure is a term that's been used, and many education jurisdictions have actually, been on board with that way of thinking and have promoted that way of thinking. And that way of thinking came from the work of Kenneth Goodman, who was the father, if you like, of whole language. And if you look at some of his writings, he was basically saying to teachers, look, you're the experts on the children in front of you in your class. Don't be too bothered by what these academics say about reading. You know the children in front of you. Close the door and teach in a way that feels right for you.
And the problem you get there is, thinking about it from a parent's perspective, is how do you know that there is consistency across teaching from one school to the other? How do you know where to send your kids? Because everybody might be doing it differently. And
even between two classrooms in the same school, there can be quite a high level of variability because some teachers are more knowledgeable and have modified their practice according to what they've been learning about evidence-based reading practices, and others are still sticking with the more eclectic balanced literacy playbook. So 2 teachers in the same school can be doing things quite differently.
Pam, can I bring it back to something you said earlier about a parent's role? And what I've seen you use, the phrase I've seen you use to preface this before is, all other factors being equal and within their capacity. So what do you mean by that?
What I mean is that we need to check our middle-class assumptions about what home environments look like. A lot of my research over the last 20 years or so has been on really vulnerable children and adolescents. I've done a lot of research on young people in the youth justice system, in the out-of-home care system. Some children, of course, move between those 2 systems. And what that has really highlighted for me is that not all children grow up in calm, orderly, child-centred home environments. A significant proportion of children are in chaotic, unpredictable, sometimes volatile, sometimes unsafe environments, being reared sometimes only by one parent, sometimes by a parent or parents with significant mental health issues, economic challenges, life's unpredictable. If you're not sure about whether you're going to be able to pay the rent and put food on the table, reading to your children, even if you can read, is not going to feel like a pressing priority. And I think we need to be mindful of the fact that the child that we see in the classroom is the tip of an iceberg, and we don't know what else is going on in home environments. And that's why we need to be really placing a premium, I think, Mel, on instructional time, because that's the space that we get to influence, that they're the levers that we get to pull. We can't directly, easily influence what's happening in children's home environments, and nor arguably should we be able to. But we do get to influence what happens when children get to school. And I think we need to respect their time. I think that's an important ethical imperative, that instructional time belongs to children. It doesn't belong to adults. Adults are the custodians of that time, but we need to not use it flippantly or for fluffy, low-impact activities. We need to understand that children can't get that time back again, and we should be sending children home at the end of the day having learnt something that they didn't know at the start of the day. I don't think that's too much to ask of schools. That they place a premium on children learning new knowledge and skills. I think there are things that we can change and things we can't change. What we can't, we need to understand and respect the variability in home contexts, home language and literacy environments, the level of stability and calm. Is going to be very variable, but the thing that we can change is the instructional context.
Yeah, because children are going to come to school with a wide spectrum of ability for all sorts of reasons, right? I guess that's where a teacher's expertise comes in knowing how to cater to that range of differences too. But that's a huge challenge for many teachers, isn't it? Because you've got the spectrum of reading ability, but also these kind of behavioural challenges that teachers say they're increasingly dealing with too, which must feed into that.
Yes, I think it does. But I also think that when teachers and schools change their instructional approach towards more explicit teaching, and adopting approaches that really promote inclusive practice and responses by all students, what we typically see is not only an uptick in achievement, but we also see a downward trend on behavioural dysregulation. I hear this repeatedly from teachers who've moved away from balanced literacy to structured explicit literacy teaching, using principles of explicit teaching, teaching, the teacher explicitly teaching with a scope and sequence, having lots of opportunities per minute for students to respond, using mini whiteboards, using turn and talk, pair share, cold calling. There are lots of those approaches that maximise participation and engagement and tend to lift the tail of the curve, both behaviourally and academically, and you really make it harder for disruptive behaviour to occur because all children know exactly what's expected of them, and it's easier for them to engage and participate. And this is a repeated message from schools that have changed their practice, that there's delight not only in the improved academic performance, but also in the improved well-being of students.
Interesting. Yeah, it was one of the things that was most surprising to me when I sat in on some of the professional development that teachers were doing, was just how much emphasis is placed on the how of the teaching rather than, there's still obviously the content and what is being taught, but those strategies around how you get a child's attention and how you the pace at which you have to teach to make sure that you maintain that, and how long you might stay on something before you move to something else. I found all of that really quite interesting. Can I bring it back to some of the things that parents can do to assist? And we hear the term language-rich interactions.
Yeah.
So can we just talk about what are some examples of what a language-rich interaction might look like?
Good question. So as I said earlier, we know that oral language under typical circumstances develops through immersive everyday experiences, because we humans are programmed in an evolutionary sense to acquire language. We need to be exposed to language, and we need to be having rich, what's been termed serve and return interactions. So like a game of tennis, somebody hits the ball over the net and we want somebody to hit it back, and we want that volley to go back and forth as many times as possible. So in the case of parent-child interaction, sometimes it's the infant who serves, and they might serve just with a vocalisation. A young infant just vocalising is a conversational serve. And then the adult carer returns by making a comment or showing a facial expression or picking the infant up, engaging in some way. And then over time, as the child's language, expressive language, starts to develop, single words and then putting words together, phrases, and then the beginnings of conversation, we want to see this serve and return going back and forth. So that's one thing, that we want lots and lots of those volleys happening across the day. But we also want to see parents, in a sense, hitting multiple balls back across the net, because we want them to be giving back more than what the child is giving. So a 1-year-old who says ball, we'd want to see the parent say, oh, yes, look, it's a ball. It's a red ball and it's rolling over to you. Are you going to catch it? So you can see that's a big return on a one-word utterance. The 1-year-old has said ball, but in return they're hearing a long, complex sentence with extra vocabulary and, of course, sentence structure. And an invitation to do something. So we really want to see those expansions occurring on and elaborations on what children are giving us, and parents using that as an opportunity to build conversations. I was in the supermarket, my local supermarket once, and there was a mother there with a child who was about 2. They were in the fruit and vegetable section and they were making decisions about what to buy, and the child was pointing at various things and they were talking about what they were called, and the mother was saying, which ones would you like? And the child was making selections, and then she said, now what does Daddy like? What sort of fruit does Daddy like? So that simple act of buying fruit is actually a language stimulation, language development exercise. It's also an opportunity to be mentalizing, to be thinking about somebody else's preferences, somebody else's choices. That's quite a conceptual thing. I know I like apples, but now I'm being invited to think about what another person likes, which is maybe going to be completely different. So language development, it also has important links into other aspects of cognitive development and empathy and emotional attunement. Now, ideally, we want that to be happening a lot across the day, and which is not to say that parents can't sometimes just give short responses when they're tired and so forth. But ideally, language develops under those circumstances of lots and lots of elaborations and expansions, because children have got the wiring there ready to go, but they need to be hearing lots of words, complex sentences. And of course, in the process, that's building their background knowledge as well, which is really important for reading comprehension.
And I guess it's something worth remembering for parents who might think, oh, I really, over the holidays or something, when we don't have to be, although it's really good to sit and read with your children, that actually maybe going out and having a new experience and talking about some new words is equally as valuable.
Absolutely.
Or is also valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So just finding incidental opportunities to add vocabulary and background knowledge is what children benefit from.
When it comes to any concerns that a parent might have about where their child is at on their reading journey, how do you balance being able to give the teacher the space to teach in the way that they are in the classroom, and when you need to advocate for your child if you don't think they're maybe developing at an age-appropriate level? What would you say is your advice around that if anyone's in that situation?
Look, it's difficult. Language doesn't develop at a uniform rate for all children, and so that needs to be our starting point, I think. And we know that reading is powered by language. So children whose language development might be lagging behind for whatever reason, then we might expect to see that they're going to find the transition to reading a little bit more challenging. So we need to take into account the normal spread of ability in language, and there is a spread of ability in reading as well. I would argue that through high-quality reading instruction, we're trying to minimise that spread. So if we think of the curve in the data, we want the curve to be more peaked than spread, and we certainly don't want that long tail of underachievement, and we want the curve to shift to the right. I think it's difficult for parents, in fact, to know whether their children are on track, and it's particularly difficult in situations where teachers are using predictable level texts for early instruction. So children are coming home with these predictable books that they look like they're reading because they've learnt the recitation pattern of having a sentence stem, turning the page and a picture changing, one word changing, but children don't need to actually focus on the text in order to be able to see what they know what the word is that's changing from the picture. And so this can create an illusion.
This could be like the elephant is at the zoo, next page, the giraffe is at the zoo. So they're not actually reading that animal's name.
They're not reading the word. They're not reading the word.
Yeah.
And what they're actually doing is leveraging off their already well-developed oral language skills and background knowledge and not engaging with the more challenging task of understanding how speech and print map to each other. Now, in the beginning stages, we wouldn't be expecting children to be getting words like elephant and giraffe off the page. But what that does is create an illusion of early reading. And right back in the 1960s, when I was at primary school, Jean Chall was talking about the year 3, year 4 slump that occurs when children look like they're reading and we get a halo effect from their oral language skills. And so they seem to be quite fluent with these predictable texts, and they get to year 3, and the pictures either aren't on every page, or the pictures don't correspond so well to the text because the text is getting longer. And these children are like sinking souffles, and there's this awful realisation for the adults, the parents and the teachers, that there's, maybe 30 or 40% of children who really aren't proficient at year 3 because they've been overly reliant on, this goes back to the 3 queuing method, I suppose, on looking at pictures and guessing. But they haven't done the hard work of developing that transferable toolkit of understanding how speech and text map to each other. So I think this makes it really extra confusing for parents because they had a child who appeared to be reading proficiently, and now all of a sudden they don't seem to be reading proficiently. So this is another way that we've inadvertently made things complex for everybody. In contexts where reading instruction is occurring explicitly and systematically and high-quality data monitoring tools are in place, I would say it's the teacher who should be alerted first to concerns, and may well still be the parent, but teachers, I would want teachers to be using high-quality progress monitoring tools that have got early warning systems built into them. If we think of the sub-skills, the decoding sub-skills that we're trying to develop early on, if children are not keeping up with their peers, then we know we've got to do something more. We've got to increase the dosage, the frequency, the intensity, the duration of that instruction, so that we're not having unpleasant surprises at the end of grade 2, after which point we know that fewer than 20% of children actually catch up. If you're behind after 3 years of formal instruction, less than 1 in 5 are going to catch up, and that's going to require intensive support. So nobody should be getting nasty surprises at the start of year 3.
Wow. Yeah, that just shows how crucial it is, those first 3 years.
Absolutely.
Then what, how much did you say? About 20%?
20%. If you're a struggling reader at year 3, there's a 20% chance that you will catch up. This has been documented in a report that was published, I think it was last year, by ERO, the Australian Education Research Organisation, and that's also been documented by previous researchers as well. So, that's a huge challenge then for schools to adequately resource those children. And we could have, in the vast majority of cases, prevented that through high-quality instruction and progress monitoring from the outset. There will always be a small group of children who have persistent difficulties for reasons that we can't always specifically identify, but it shouldn't be, we shouldn't be getting to year 3 with sometimes 30, 40% of children needing intervention services. As Anita Archer says, you can't intervene your way out of a tier 1 problem. If you've got that many children needing intervention, you've got a tier 1 problem.
Yeah. Pam, you've been wonderful, and it's been useful, I know, both for parents and teachers. Is there anything you would want to say just in closing around a parent's role particularly?
Look, I would encourage parents to be parents, to talk to their children as much as possible across the day. Sometimes I'm asked about screen use, and I think that's a fairly contentious issue. I perhaps controversially am sometimes a little more concerned about parents' screen use than children's, because I think adults tend to be very fixated on their devices. sometimes at the expense of opportunities to be engaging with their children, whether we're talking infants or preschoolers or school-age children. So I think some screen hygiene and some conversations within families about screen hygiene is really important, because children model their behaviour on the behaviour of the adults in their world. And when children see adults constantly obsessing over screens and distracted by screens, then we shouldn't be too surprised that they also think that screens are a really important and highly valued part of their lives. I would also encourage parents, if they can, to let their children see them reading books, actual hard copy books, because books don't have other apps on them that distract us as readers. And I think distraction and, potentially reduced attention spans are something that we should be worried about with the impost of screens in our lives. So I think having some screen-free time, children seeing adults reading books. Now, not all adults enjoy reading and read for leisure and pleasure, but I think we need to be very careful about how adults are using and modelling screen use.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as you say, it's not just about that interest in the phone, it's the opportunity cost of using the phone where you miss out on those language-rich interactions that we've been talking about. Pam Snow, thank you so much for your time. Very much appreciated. And I know this information will be very useful to so many. So
it's been really lovely talking to you, Mel. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. If that topic was helpful for you and you'd like to hear more, please do like and subscribe. It sends me that feedback. School Shorts is all about supporting busy parents who want their children to thrive. Follow on social at School Shorts NZ for fun ideas, helpful resources, and exclusive giveaways.